So, picture this. In August of 1835, thousands of New Yorkers literally rushed the streets to buy a copy of a newspaper called The Sun.
Right. It was absolute chaos.
Yeah, totally. Like if you were walking down Broadway that week, you would have seen these massive crowds of people huddled together, reading the front page aloud with just absolute breathless amazement.
Because the paper was reporting with, rigorous scientific certainty that an astronomer in South Africa had built this massive new telescope and made a groundbreaking discovery.
Yeah. He had found life on the moon.
And not just microbes, right?
No, not at all. The newspaper detailed these lush ruby amphitheaters, unicorn-like animals, and, most shockingly, a civilization of 4-foot-tall bat-winged humanoids flying through the lunar atmosphere.
And it was presented with complete, sober authority. They even cited an academic journal from Edinburgh to back up the findings.
And the people of New York just bought it completely, like they ate it up.
They really did.
A few weeks later, the paper quietly admitted it was all a fabrication, but by then, well, The Sun had established itself as one of the most successful newspapers in the world.
Which is just wild to think about today.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening a massive dossier simply titled Misinformation_.pdf to answer one incredibly terrifying question for you. Why is the human brain so eager to believe a lie?
It's a question that gets to the very core of our cognitive architecture.
Right.
We like to think of ourselves as these rational creatures who seek out the truth, but the reality is much darker and, frankly, much more interesting.
Definitely.
And this dossier we are looking at doesn't just cover modern social media. It tracks the mechanics of false belief through history, psychology, and, structural systems.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to map out this entire landscape. We're going to guide you through the historical roots of fake news, explore the exact biological reasons why our brains prefer a good story over a dry fact.
Which is a huge part of it.
Exactly, and we'll outline the precise threshold where a harmless myth metastasizes into something genuinely dangerous.
Yeah.
And eventually, we're going to get to the psychological reality of how to actually change a mind. And I want to set the tone early here. We aren't here to judge anyone for being gullible.
No, not at all.
We're all susceptible to this stuff.
We really are. The moment you decide you are entirely immune to being fooled it's the exact moment your cognitive defenses drop.
Right. You just leave yourself open.
You become the easiest mark in the room. And to understand how our modern systems exploit this, we have to recognize that the internet did not invent misinformation.
No, it really didn't.
It just gave it an industrial-scale distribution network.
Right. I mean, it's so easy to blame the algorithm, but this dossier starts way back in antiquity with a category it calls strategic narrative warfare.
Yes.
Long before you could buy a bot farm, you had figures like Augustus in ancient Rome running these highly organized smear campaigns.
The rivalry between Augustus, who was then known as Octavian, and Mark Antony, is really the absolute gold standard for strategic misinformation.
It's basically an ancient PR campaign.
Exactly. Octavian was consolidating power after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Antony was his primary rival, stationed in Egypt, allied with Cleopatra.
Right.
And Octavian needed to start a war against Antony, but declaring war on a fellow Roman was politically dangerous. It could spark a massive domestic rebellion.
So he didn't attack Antony the general, he attacked Antony the man.
He ran a systemic character assassination. Octavian needed the Roman public to view this not as a civil war, but as a foreign war of defense.
Wow.
So he crafted a narrative that Antony had completely lost his mind, that he was under the magical, seductive spell of Cleopatra.
Like he was brainwashed or something.
Yes, and that he was planning to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria. Octavian even claimed to have illegally obtained Antony's will to, quote-unquote, prove Antony was leaving Roman territories to Cleopatra's children.
And the way he distributed this fake news is just wild. The dossier notes he literally minted the propaganda onto the currency.
Coins were the mass media of the ancient world. You put a slogan or an image on a coin, and it travels through every marketplace.
Just passing through the hands of soldiers, merchants, citizens, everyone sees it.
Exactly. Octavian minted coins, highlighting his own Roman virtues, contrasting them with rumors he spread through poetry and public speeches, painting Antony as this Eastern degenerate.
It's just wild to think about the deliberation there. Like, Augustus knew he was lying, or at least wildly
Oh,
exaggerating.
absolutely.
But the truth that Antony and Cleopatra were just engaging in a complex, mutually beneficial geopolitical alliance, that was inconvenient. Complexity doesn't rally troops.
And the result was the Battle of Actium, the defeat of Antony, and the creation of the Roman Empire under Augustus.
So it worked perfectly.
It did. The source material evaluates the severity of this as medium-high. It wasn't just a lie. It was a structural manipulation of reality that optimized for absolute political authority over accuracy.
Right.
It proved that if the narrative is compelling enough, well, people will gladly ignore the nuance.
Which leads right into a different archetype the dossier brings up, institutionalized falsehood.
Right, the donation of Constantine.
Yeah. It's one thing for a politician to lie during a war. But what happens when an entire massive institution bases its power on a fabricated document?
This is one of the most audacious forgeries in human history. The donation of Constantine was a document that miraculously appeared in the 8th century.
Right.
But it claimed to be a decree written by the Roman Emperor Constantine way back in the 4th century.
So 400 years earlier.
Right. And the text of this forged document claimed that Constantine, out of gratitude for being cured of leprosy, had transferred absolute political authority over Rome and the entire western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope.
Wow.
It effectively said that the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, but the supreme secular ruler of Western Europe.
And the kings and emperors of Europe just accepted this, like a piece of paper magically turns up centuries later saying the Pope is their boss, and they just went with it.
For centuries, yes, they did. The papacy used it aggressively during the Middle Ages to assert dominance over secular monarchs.
That is unbelievable.
It wasn't definitively debunked until the 1400s, when a Catholic priest and brilliant linguist named Lorenzo Valla analyzed the Latin in the document.
Ah, okay.
He proved that the vocabulary used in the text contained anachronisms, like words and phrasing that didn't even exist in the 4th century. It was undeniably written in 8th century Latin.
That is so funny. It's the medieval equivalent of finding an email printed out and dated 1985.
Exactly.
But the damage was done. The source rates the severity here as high because it dictated hundreds of years of European political structure.
Yeah, it shaped history.
But both of these examples, Augustus and the papal forgery, they involve central architects. Someone sitting in a room, twirling their mustache, writing a lie.
Right, a deliberate creator.
But the dossier brings up the Salem Witch Trials of 1692, which is a totally different beast.
Salem is the archetype of emergent contagion. There was no single mastermind pulling the strings to consolidate power.
Right, it was just organic.
It was a social panic. It began with a few young girls having unexplained fits and accusing a local enslaved woman, Tituba, of witchcraft.
And then it just exploded. What really fascinates me about Salem is how they handle evidence. The dossier specifically talks about the acceptance of spectral evidence.
Yes, spectral evidence was the idea that a witch could send her spirit, or a specter, to torment a victim.
Which is terrifying.
So if a girl in the courtroom claimed she saw the invisible ghost of her neighbor biting her, the court accepted that as empirical proof of witchcraft, even if the accused neighbor was standing right there doing nothing.
Because how do you disprove an invisible ghost? You can't. It's a completely unfalsifiable claim.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder how an entire community of adults like judges, magistrates, community leaders, how did they just abandon all critical thinking for something so demonstrably absurd?
It was because of the environment. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was under immense pressure.
Right. Yeah.
They had brutal winters, ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes, factional town disputes, and a deeply rigid religious worldview that viewed the devil as a literal physical presence in the woods.
So they were basically primed for a panic.
When it started, it functioned as a pressure release valve.
Yeah.
It was a way to explain their suffering. The motivation wasn't necessarily a conscious desire to lie. It was a desperate psychological need for certainty in a terrifying world.
And the consequence was 20 executions.
Yes.
The dossier gives this a very high severity rating because the panic directly resulted in death. The need for a simple explanation completely overpowered any demand for actual evidence.
Right.
Which really brings us back to the Great Moon hoax of 1835 that we opened with.
Yes, the performative, profit-driven misinformation.
Because unlike Salem, the moon hoax wasn't born out of fear. It was born out of capitalism.
It's hard.
The penny press was exploding in New York. Papers needed to sell copies. So Richard Adams Locke, a reporter for The Sun, just completely made up the moon story.
And he didn't just casually mention it. He wrote a 6-part serialized epic.
So the Great Moon Hoax was basically the 1835 version of pure clickbait.
It really was. He optimized for pure engagement. It is the exact same psychological trigger as modern clickbait. The writers knew it was fabricated, but they also know that a dry report about a slightly larger telescope lens wouldn't sell papers.
Right, but Batmen sell papers.
Batmen sell papers.
It's funny, but the dossier points out this profit-driven model scales into horrifying territory incredibly fast. Like it jumps from the moon hoax to yellow journalism in 1898.
Yes, the Spanish-American War. Newspaper moguls like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were in a fierce circulation war.
Just fighting for readers.
Exactly. So when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, which historians now widely believe was an internal accidental explosion, the newspapers immediately, without evidence, blamed the Spanish.
Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. They even created a catchy slogan.
They published lurid, fabricated illustrations of Spanish saboteurs. They completely invented atrocities to whip the American public into a frenzy.
And it worked.
It did. The United States went to war. It's the ultimate example of how slower truth will consistently lose to faster outrage when there's a financial incentive tied to audience attention.
The last historical archetype the dossier hits is epistemic failure. And this one is actually sort of tragic, because it's not politicians or greedy publishers.
No.
It's scientists, the people who are literally trained to find the truth.
Right, the Piltdown Man fraud of 1912.
Yeah, tell us about that one.
So an amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson claimed to have found fossilized remains in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. It looked like a skull that was half ape, half human.
Okay.
He presented it as the missing evolutionary link.
And the scientific establishment just
Yeah.
bought it. The biggest minds in British paleontology looked at it and signed off on it.
They accepted it for 40 years. It wasn't exposed as a hoax until 1953, when new fluorine dating tests proved it was just a relatively modern human skull combined with the jawbone of an orangutan.
What?
Yeah. They had literally filed down the teeth to make them look like they fit together and stained the bones with chemicals to make them look ancient.
But how did the most brilliant scientists of the era miss file marks on the teeth? I mean, that's crazy.
Confirmation bias combined with national pride.
Ah, there it is.
At the time, early human ancestors like the Neanderthal had been found in Germany and others in France. The British scientific establishment desperately wanted a native British fossil to prove that England played a central role in human evolution.
They just wanted it to be true so badly.
The Piltdown Man was exactly what they wanted to find. When a piece of evidence perfectly matches your deeply held desires, your critical faculties tend to just shut down.
So you look at this sweep of history, right? Augustus manipulating empires, forged papal decrees, deadly witch hunts, fabricated moonbats, and scientists getting fooled by a filed-down monkey jaw. It's a lot.
It makes it really clear that the human brain isn't wired for objective reality. We are wired for survival, for social cohesion, and for satisfying narratives.
The overarching lesson of pre-internet misinformation is that it was slow to spread, but incredibly durable. Because there was no decentralized way to fact-check, a forged document could shape a continent for hundreds of years.
Right.
The noise was lower, but once a lie took hold, it practically became concrete reality.
It makes sense why an emperor or a medieval church would lie. Like, they wanted empires. And it makes sense why people panicked in Salem. They were terrified.
Sure.
But that doesn't really explain the mundane stuff. Why does an entire generation of people decide to believe that cracking your knuckles causes arthritis, or that Napoleon was tiny? There's no money or power to be gained there.
That brings us into the realm of what the dossier calls soft misinformation, or proto-memes. These are the historical myths that spread simply because they are cognitively easy to process. They tell a good story. Like the flat earth theory. I think a lot of people assume the flat earth thing is a holdover from the Dark Ages, but the dossier specifically points out it was actually heavily revived in the 1800s.
Yes, by an English writer named Samuel Rowbottom. He performed these highly publicized pseudoscientific experiments on a straight stretch of water called the Bedford Level.
Okay.
He argued that because he couldn't see the curvature of the Earth over a few miles, the Earth must be flat.
It caught on because it appeals to our most basic instinct, like trust your own eyes.
Exactly.
It offers a wonderfully simple, intuitive model of the universe. It completely strips away the terrifying complexity of astrophysics and just says, hey, look out your window, looks flat, right?
Exactly. It replaces a complex reality with a visually accessible fiction. You see the exact same mechanism in the myth that humans only use 10% of their brains.
Oh man, I remember hearing that one constantly growing up. Even teachers would repeat it.
It likely stems from a misinterpretation of early 20th century neurological research, particularly quotes attributed to psychologist William James about humans only meeting a fraction of our mental potential.
Right, but it morphed into a literal biological claim.
Yes. And from an anatomical standpoint, it's entirely false. Evolution would never maintain a massive, energy-hungry organ like the human brain if 90% of it were dormant. We use virtually every part of our brain throughout the day.
But the 10% myth is so incredibly seductive, it's the ultimate motivational framing.
It is.
It tells you that you have this massive, untapped superpower just sitting inside your skull waiting to be unlocked. It's the plot of a dozen sci-fi movies. We believe it because it feels incredibly good to believe it.
It's an uplifting form of misinformation. Just like the myth of Napoleon Bonaparte's height is a comforting form of political slander.
Ah, yes, the Napoleon complex.
Yeah.
This guy was a military genius who conquered most of Europe, and our enduring cultural memory of him is that he was incredibly short and angry about it.
Right. In reality, he was about 5'6" or 5'7", which was perfectly average for a Frenchman in the early 1800s.
So not even unusually short.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But the British cartoonist James Gilray produced these incredibly popular satirical prints depicting Napoleon as a tiny, temperamental child throwing tantrums.
Wow.
The British propaganda apparatus pushed this heavily to diminish his intimidating reputation.
And it's stuck. 200 years later, we are still using British wartime propaganda to describe short guys at the bar who get a little too aggressive.
What's fascinating here is that the dossier refers to these as aesthetic misinformation. They are ideas that are historically false, but culturally productive. The image of Vikings wearing horned helmets is another perfect example.
Okay, this one shattered my childhood. You're telling me Vikings never wore horned helmets into battle?
There is virtually zero archaeological evidence for it.
Really?
Yeah. If you think about it practically, wearing massive horns on your head during close-quarters medieval combat is a terrible idea. An enemy could easily grab a horn and snap your neck, or a weapon could catch on it.
That makes total sense. So where did the image even come from?
It was invented in the 1870s by a costume designer named Carl Emil Dupler.
Wait, a costume designer?
Yes, he was designing the wardrobe for Richard Wagner's epic opera, The Ring Cycle. He just thought horned helmets looked imposing and dramatic on stage.
I mean, that's just so embarrassing for us. We based our entire visual understanding of a historical civilization on a 19th century theater prop.
It's pretty funny.
That is deeply embarrassing for us as a species.
But again, it proved that striking visuals and simple narratives will always defeat complex, messy reality. The same goes for the American myth of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and saying, "I cannot tell a lie."
Right, invented out of whole cloth by Parson Weems, a biographer writing shortly after Washington's death. He just wanted to mythologize the founding father and sell books.
He literally used a lie to teach children about the importance of honesty. The irony is palpable.
It really is. But that irony actually raises a really practical question for me. If a kid reads the cherry tree story and learns to stop lying to their parents, well, does it really matter that the story itself is fake? Like, if I think Vikings had horns, who cares? When does a helpful or harmless myth actually become a problem for you and me?
That is the pivotal question of the entire dossier. Believing that a Viking wore a theater prop is harmless in isolation.
Right.
But what it does is condition the brain. It normalizes the habit of accepting information without evidence, simply because the information is aesthetically pleasing or emotionally satisfying.
It builds the muscle of gullibility.
Precisely. If your default cognitive setting is to just accept a good story, you are left completely defenseless when a bad actor comes along with a dangerous story. Which brings us to the architecture of danger. The dossier doesn't just say some lies are bad and some are fine. It outlines a very rigid framework of 3 exact thresholds that must be crossed for a harmless myth to metastasize into a societal threat.
Okay, let's break these down. Threshold number 1, behavioral influence.
This asks a simple question. Does the belief alter how a person acts in the physical world?
Got it.
The Viking helmet myth sits solely in your imagination. It is purely decorative. But if someone tells you that drinking a specific herb will cure an infection, that belief moves from decoration to instruction. You might decide not to go to the doctor.
Right.
The moment a piece of misinformation changes real-world physical behavior, the first threshold of danger is crossed.
Makes sense. Threshold number 2, consequence amplification.
This assesses the cost of the behavior. Let's look at the 10% brain myth. If you deeply believe you only use 10% of your brain, your behavior might change.
Like you might go to a bookstore and spend $20 on a pseudoscientific self-help book.
Exactly. The cost of that error is low. You wasted 20 bucks. But let's look at the Spanish-American War propaganda. The behavior was enlisting in the military, and the consequence was mass casualty and geopolitical destabilization.
Huge difference.
The exact same mechanism of belief can be a mild annoyance or a lethal threat, purely dependent on the downstream cost of the action.
So it has to change behavior, and that behavior has to have a high cost. What is the third threshold?
The third is constraint on truth-seeking. This happens when the belief becomes a closed, self-sealing system.
Okay.
Harmless misinformation is usually open to correction. If you're talking about Vikings at a party and a historian corrects you about the helmets, you'll probably just say, "Oh, wow, I had no idea," and update your worldview. You aren't emotionally invested.
Right. I'm not going to throw a punch over Carl Emil Doppler's opera costume.
No, of course not. But dangerous misinformation actively protects itself. It builds a moat.
It gets defensive.
Yes. It tells the believer that anyone trying to correct the belief is an enemy, part of a conspiracy, or deeply ignorant. It creates a framework where evidence against the belief is interpreted as proof of how deep the cover-up goes.
And the dossier introduces a specific psychological mechanism that accelerates a belief across all three of those thresholds, like the absolute gasoline on the fire, and that is identity.
Yes. When a piece of information gets entangled with your sense of self, your status, or your community belonging, the normal rules of logic just completely evaporate.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It ceases to be about the data, and it becomes about who am I and who is my tribe.
So it's not about how smart you are, it's about protecting who you are.
Exactly.
It's like wearing a sports jersey. If I'm at a bar wearing my team's colors and some guy comes up to me and starts rattling off statistics about why my team's defense is mathematically terrible, well, I do not pull out my phone to verify his math.
You really don't care about his spreadsheets.
No, I don't care about his spreadsheets at all. My identity is tied to that jersey. So an attack on the team's data feels exactly like a physical threat against my own body. I just get defensive and I start yelling.
That analogy perfectly captures the neurological reality. When core identity beliefs are challenged, neuroimaging shows that the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes physical threats and fear, actually lights up.
Wow.
Your brain literally cannot distinguish between a predator attacking you in the woods and a person attacking your deeply held ideological belief.
So the intellect just completely shuts down to protect the ego.
Completely. And that is why dangerous misinformation is so extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. It isn't an intellectual error. It is an identity defense mechanism.
All right, keeping that framework in mind, behavior, consequence, and identity. Let's look at the modern internet. Our feeds are saturated with what the dossier categorizes into two types of everyday modern myths. The first is playful wrongness.
These are the high-volume, culturally sticky myths that just refuse to die, but have effectively zero behavioral stakes. Like the idea that a goldfish has a 3-second memory.
Which is completely false, really.
Very false. Fish biologists have trained goldfish to navigate mazes and remember spatial cues for months at a time.
That's amazing.
But the 3-second myth is just so convenient. We use it as an analogy for our own short attention spans.
Or the deeply ingrained belief that cracking your knuckles causes arthritis.
I used to hear that every single day.
Oh, same here.
There is zero physiological evidence for it. In fact, a researcher named Donald Unger actually cracked the knuckles of his left hand only every single day for 60 years while leaving his right hand alone, just to prove there would be no difference in arthritis.
You're kidding.
No. He even won an Ig Nobel Prize for it. The myth likely started just because parents and teachers found the popping sound incredibly annoying, and they needed a scary-sounding medical excuse to make kids stop.
It's a behavioral control myth. Same with breaking a mirror giving you 7 years of bad luck.
Pure folklore.
Yeah, based on ancient Roman ideas that mirrors reflected the soul and that life renewed itself every 7 years. It's playful. But then the dossier outlines a second, slightly sharper category of everyday internet myths: functional simplifications.
Functional simplifications are factually wrong, but they serve a psychological or practical purpose. The classic example is the absolute certainty among parents that sugar makes children hyperactive.
See, I know the science says this is false. I know multiple double-blind studies have shown sugar does not alter a child's behavior, but I swear, when you are standing in the middle of a 5-year-old's birthday party and they've just eaten cake, Your eyes tell you a completely different story. They are bouncing off the walls.
It looks so real in the moment.
The confirmation bias is so intensely powerful.
That's because the environmental context is causing the hyperactivity. It's a birthday party. There are friends, games, loud noises, and immense excitement.
So the sugar is just along for the ride.
The sugar is just a passenger. But the human brain craves a simple, singular cause and effect relationship to explain chaotic situations. Blaming the cake is much easier than analyzing the sociological stimulation of a party.
It's functional. It gives the parent an illusion of control. Just don't feed them cake and they will calm down. Another massive one is the left-brained versus right-brained personality types.
The idea that left-brained people are strictly analytical and mathematical, while right-brained people are purely creative and artistic.
It's everywhere. It's in corporate team-building exercises. It's in school quizzes.
And neurologically, it is a massive oversimplification. Yes, certain functions show lateralization like language processing, often leaning to the left hemisphere, but the brain operates as a highly integrated network.
So they work together.
Complex tasks, whether solving a math equation or painting a landscape, require dense, constant communication across the corpus callosum between both hemispheres. The rigid binary doesn't exist.
But the myth survives because humans desperately love categorizing themselves. It reduces cognitive load. It's so much easier to say, I'm a right-brain creative, than to deal with the messy reality of a highly adaptable neurological network.
The dossier also points out tech myths, like the absolute compulsion people have to constantly force close the background apps on their smartphones to save battery.
Okay, guilty. I'm constantly swiping up to clear my screen.
Software engineers at Apple and Google have repeatedly explained that modern operating systems are specifically designed to freeze background apps in RAM, which takes almost zero power.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When you force close an app, you purge it from RAM, meaning the next time you open it, the phone has to expend significantly more CPU power to boot it up from scratch. By trying to save battery, you are actively draining it faster.
Closing apps on your iPhone is basically the modern equivalent of blowing into a Nintendo cartridge. It feels like you're fixing it, even if tech experts say otherwise.
It really is. But the dossier issues a clear warning about these functional simplifications. Even though the behavioral cost of draining your phone battery a little faster is low, the cumulative effect of these myths is insidious.
Because they brush right up against real harm. Like if a kid takes a quiz and decides they are just right-brained, they might completely write off their ability to learn advanced math or chemistry. They cap their own potential based on a misunderstood psychological meme.
Precisely.
And the algorithm just accelerates all of this, feeding us the simple, satisfying answers on a loop until our brains are fundamentally trained to reject complexity.
Which brings us to the core epistemological crisis of our era. If we are surrounded by all of this easily verifiable data, if you can debunk the sugar myth or the left brain myth with a 5-second web search, why is society completely tearing itself apart over bigger realities?
Yeah, why can't we just present the facts and fix the political divide?
The dossier states that we are trapped because we fundamentally confuse facts with values. We don't know how to categorize the claims we hear.
This is the epistemology trap. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. The source breaks down every statement we encounter into 3 categories. The first is empirical claims.
Empirical claims are strictly testable assertions about physical reality. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The city's murder rate decreased by 4% last year. This pill lowers blood pressure.
Right. You can pull out a thermometer, a spreadsheet, or a medical monitor and prove it.
Correct. The second category is normative claims. These are purely subjective value judgments, moral statements, or opinions. Vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate. Capitalism is inherently unfair. People should be kinder to one another.
So these cannot be measured or proven by a scientific instrument.
Exactly. And then there is the third category, which is where all the chaos happens. Mixed claims.
Mixed claims tangle testable facts, debatable interpretations, and subjective values into a single knot. Like, if someone says the new tax policy is a disaster that is ruining the middle class, they are combining an empirical data point. A tax policy exists with an economic interpretation ruining the middle class and a normative value judgment. It is a disaster.
And this leads to the most important definition in the entire 40-page document. Misinformation is defined strictly as a false or misleading empirical claim presented as fact.
Got it. It is not an opinion. It is not an interpretation.
Exactly. If two stockbrokers look at the exact same accurate employment report, and one says, this means the market is about to boom, and the other says, this means the market is dangerously overheated, neither of them is spreading misinformation.
They are just drawing different hypotheses from the same shared reality. Misinformation occurs when someone fabricates the numbers on the employment report itself.
But help cut through this, the dossier provides a fantastic three-step practical test for any claim you encounter. Step 1. What specific part of this statement is actually testable? Step 2. What precise piece of evidence would be required to change my mind? And Step 3. Does the person making this claim have a built-in way to be wrong?
That final step is the ultimate litmus test. In a healthy, truth-seeking framework, a person can define the conditions under which they would admit defeat. If you show me a peer-reviewed study with a sample size of 10,000, I will change my view.
Right.
But in a misinformation ecosystem, the belief is completely closed. No amount of data, no video evidence, and no court ruling will ever change their mind. Any contradictory evidence is just immediately dismissed as part of the conspiracy.
It becomes unfalsifiable.
But wait, the source says to look for expert consensus. Didn't you just tell us that all the experts agreed on the fake Piltdown man's skull in 1912? How can we trust consensus when the experts can be so wildly wrong?
This raises an important question, and it is a critical distinction to make. Consensus is not a magical guarantee of absolute infallible truth. Science is a messy process of becoming incrementally less wrong over time. But consensus remains a highly reliable, probabilistic indicator. It's the safest bet based on currently available data. The defining difference between scientific consensus and dogmatic misinformation is the mechanism for updates.
The ability to change course.
Exactly. When the fluorine testing definitively proved the Piltdown skull was a hoax in 1953, the scientific consensus didn't double down. It didn't accuse the fluorine testers of a massive conspiracy.
It updated.
Yes, it absorbed the blow, admitted the error, and corrected the textbooks. Misinformation does the exact opposite. It moves the goalposts. So changing your mind when new, stronger data emerges isn't a weakness. It is the defining hallmark of a healthy epistemology.
Okay, now we are going to take this epistemology framework and apply it to the most volatile material in the dossier. The document outlines a list of 100 modern high-stakes case studies, categorizing them into tiers of harm.
And it is essential to contextualize our approach here. We are wading into heavily charged cultural and political waters. But we are not here to debate policy. We are not taking political sides, and we are not endorsing an ideology. We are strictly reporting the dossier's analysis of the empirical mechanics of these specific claims, evaluating how they operate under the hood.
We're just looking at the blueprints. Tier 1 is categorized as high risk, meaning this misinformation drives immediate real-world harm. The first subcategory is health.
The dossier highlights the persistent claim that vaccines cause autism, alongside claims that unverified detox teas can cure complex diseases, or that the flu shot intentionally infects you with the flu.
Let's focus on the vaccine autism claim. This is a purely empirical claim. It is testable, and the dossier notes that massive global studies spanning millions of children have definitively found no causal link.
Right.
The original 1998 paper that sparked the panic was fully retracted, and its author lost his medical license for unethical practices. So, in an environment saturated with the correct data, how does this myth survive?
Because of the asymmetry of emotional incentives, a dry statistical study showing no correlation has very little emotional resonance.
Of course not.
But an anecdotal story from a terrified parent about their child changing after a medical procedure is viscerally powerful. It bypasses the intellect and hits the biological imperative to protect offspring.
That makes a lot of sense.
It also capitalizes on a deeply ingrained, generalized distrust of massive pharmaceutical institutions. The behavioral consequence is severe vaccine hesitancy, leading to the resurgence of eradicated diseases like measles, and it heavily triggers the identity lock. Parents view their skepticism not as an error, but as proof of their fierce love and protection for their children.
Next in Tier 1 is climate and environmental misinformation. Claims like human-driven climate change is a complete hoax. Again, an empirical claim involving global physics and chemistry. The consensus overwhelmingly supports human-driven warming. So why the deep skepticism?
It is driven by the sheer complexity of the system. Climate science involves incredibly complex modeling of atmospheric gases, ocean currents, and thermal dynamics over decades.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
The human brain struggles to comprehend systemic risk on a multi-generational timeline. When faced with terrifying complexity that demands difficult behavioral changes, the psychological defense mechanism is denial.
It's just easier.
Yes. The simple narrative, it's just a natural cycle, don't worry about it, is far more comforting than the complex truth. And of course, there are massive economic incentives protecting legacy energy industries that amplify the simple narrative.
Then there is civic and electoral misinformation. This is the bedrock of societal stability. The dossier examines claims of widespread, systemic fraud changing national election outcomes, particularly when presented without any corresponding evidence.
The mechanics here rely heavily on loss aversion. Psychologically, human beings experience the pain of losing much more intensely than the joy of winning.
Right.
When a massive political group loses an election, the emotional trauma is acute. The easiest psychological defense against that pain is the belief that they didn't actually lose, but were cheated. The dossier notes that in heavily litigated cases, extensive audits and court reviews repeatedly find no evidence of widespread outcome-altering fraud. But the empirical data cannot penetrate the psychological armor.
Because it's tied to their political identity.
Because the claim is amplified by hyper-partisan media ecosystems, it becomes entirely self-sealing. A lost court case isn't seen as proof the claim was false. It's framed as proof that the courts themselves are in on the conspiracy.
The danger there is purely systemic. It erodes the baseline trust required for a democracy to function. The final Tier 1 category is financial misinformation, guaranteed crypto returns, easy passive income, and algorithmic day trading schemes.
These prey on economic anxiety and hope, but they rely on a very specific cognitive glitch: survivorship bias.
This is one of the most eye-opening concepts for me. So the passive income is easy. Myth survives because of survivorship bias. It is exactly like walking into a massive casino, standing next to the craps table, and choosing to only interview the two guys who are screaming in celebration because they just hit a jackpot. Meanwhile, you completely ignore the 300 people quietly shuffling out the back door to find an ATM because they lost their rent money. If you only look at the visible winners, the empirical claim that gambling is a great career seems completely true.
That is exactly how social media distorts financial reality. The algorithm only promotes the flashy influencers standing in front of a rented Lamborghini talking about their crypto wins.
They never show the losses.
The algorithm buries the thousands of silent users who lost their savings. The behavioral consequence is direct, catastrophic financial ruin for vulnerable people.
Then the dossier moves to Tier 2, moderate risk. This is misinformation that might not cause an immediate systemic collapse, but creates cumulative long-term harm. This includes psychological and social myths.
Claims like mental illness is just a lack of willpower, or venting anger by hitting a pillow always helps, or the deeply ingrained educational myth of strict learning styles, the idea that some kids are strictly visual learners and others are strictly auditory.
Let's look at the learning styles one because it sounds so harmless, right? The VARK, model, visual, oral, read, write, kinesthetic. I was tested on this in school.
But decades of cognitive psychology research show no empirical evidence that tailoring instruction to these rigid styles improves learning outcomes.
Wait, none?
None. The brain learns best through meaning and multimodal integration, not by being boxed into a single sensory input. But it spread because it felt highly intuitive to teachers, and it gave students an easy excuse if they struggled. I'm not bad at reading, I'm just a kinesthetic learner.
The harm there is cumulative. It limits how a student approaches a challenge. The pattern across both Tier 1 and Tier 2 is that the misinformation drives consequential behavior, avoiding doctors, losing money, limiting education, and wraps itself so tightly in identity that correction feels like an assault.
Which logically forces us to address the most sensitive areas of human belief imaginable. If identity and belief are so closely tied, how do we handle religion and core political ideology? Can they be classified as misinformation?
This is where we have to be surgically precise. The dossier creates a hard firewall between metaphysical claims and empirical claims.
Metaphysical claims exist entirely outside the realm of physical measurement. Statements like, God created the universe, or the soul is immortal, or karma dictates the universe.
Right.
These are fundamentally non-falsifiable. You cannot put karma in a test tube. You cannot measure heaven with a satellite. Because they cannot be proven false by empirical data, they fall into the category of theology, philosophy, or personal belief. They are not, by definition, misinformation.
So you can't use a ruler to measure how much a song makes you cry. If a claim doesn't have a built-in way to be proven wrong, we shouldn't be using the word misinformation to describe it at all.
Precisely.
But the dossier notes that religion can cross the line if it makes a specific, testable historical claim.
Right. If a religious group claims there is definitive archaeological proof of a miracle buried at this exact GPS coordinate, and archaeologists dig there and find conclusive evidence that it was a 19th century hoax, that specific historical subclaim is misinformation.
Okay, I see.
The underlying spiritual theology remains untouched, but the physical claim crossed into the empirical realm and failed.
Politics is even messier because of what the dossier calls the blend.
Politics operates almost entirely on mixed claims. When a politician says we must lower taxes because the current rate is suffocating innovation, they are blending an economic theory with a normative value judgment about what suffocating means.
Right.
If you and I disagree on whether taxes should be 20% or 30%, we are debating values, priorities, and economic modeling. That is the necessary friction of a democracy.
Yeah.
It is not misinformation.
But if a politician stands at a podium and says 10,000 ballots were cast by dead people in this specific county, that is an empirical, testable claim. You can look at the voter rolls, you can look at the death certificates. If the evidence conclusively shows that only 2 dead people remained on the rolls due to clerical errors, the politician's claim is absolute misinformation.
We have to isolate the testable empirical claim from the underlying value system. Disagreements in politics and religion feel so incredibly intense because they are the very engines of meaning, purpose, and tribal belonging. But confusing a moral disagreement with an empirical lie is destroying our ability to communicate.
Which perfectly sets up the next section of the dossier, the not misinformation graveyard. Because society has become so hyper-aware of fake news since 2016, misinformation has just become a weaponized buzzword. We slap that label on anything we don't like.
The source outlines several categories of information that are frequently and dangerously mislabeled. The first is legitimate scientific uncertainty.
Oh, like during COVID.
Exactly. We saw this extensively during the early chaotic months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Early guidance on surface transmission or mask efficacy shifted as virologists studied a novel pathogen in real time.
And people were screaming misinformation every time the CDC updated guideline.
But updating guidance based on new, superior data is not misinformation. It is the scientific method working precisely as intended under extreme pressure. To label evolving science as misinformation betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of how knowledge is acquired.
Another category in the graveyard is differing interpretations of complex data. If 2 economists look at an inflation report and one says the Fed needs to raise rates and the other says raising rates will cause a recession, neither is lying. They are applying different macroeconomic theories to the same facts.
The dossier also includes incomplete breaking news. In the first few hours of a crisis, initial reports are almost always messy and partially incorrect. When journalists issue corrections a few hours later, that is a correction of partial knowledge, not malicious deception.
All right.
The same goes for predictions. If a pundit predicts a specific foreign policy will bring peace, and 5 years later it causes a war, the prediction wasn't misinformation. It was just a profoundly wrong forecast.
So basically, being wrong about a prediction or changing your mind when new data comes out isn't misinformation, it's just called learning. But why is the dossier so adamant about defining what isn't misinformation? What's the danger in overlabeling?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the danger is massive. Because if we start calling legitimate scientific evolution, differing economic interpretations, and bad predictions misinformation, we completely strip the word of its utility.
It just becomes meaningless.
We erode public trust even further. If every simple disagreement or honest mistake is labeled a malicious lie, we destroy the shared vocabulary needed to identify actual systemic deception.
That makes perfect sense. But now we have to wade into the truly dark waters. We've defined the terms. But Section 9 of the dossier looks at the underlying mechanical systems manipulating us. And it starts with a concept that frankly blew my mind. Malinformation.
Misinformation is a false claim. Malinformation is a true claim that is weaponized to create a false conclusion.
So it's true information that lies to you.
Precisely. Imagine taking a highly accurate, verified statistic about a very specific subset of crime, completely stripping it of all historical, demographic, and geographic context, and presenting it to push a terrifying, distorted narrative that the entire country is collapsing.
Okay, wow.
Every single number you cited is technically true, but the reality you constructed in the listener's mind is a total fabrication.
The dossier calls this the half-truth problem. The most dangerous and viral narratives aren't 100% false. Complete fabrications are usually too absurd to gain traction outside of fringe groups. The truly dangerous narratives are 40% false, carefully wrapped around a core that is 60% demonstrably true.
And this is exactly why traditional fact-checking is failing us. A fact-checker will look at the narrative, isolate the 40% that is false, and publish a debunking.
Right, they attack the lie.
But the believer looks at the debunking, anchors themselves entirely to the 60% that is true, and says, look, you can't deny this part happened. The fact-checker is ignoring the truth. The half-truth acts as a titanium shield for the lie.
So, what does this all mean? It's like movie trailers. If you take a 2-hour, lighthearted romantic comedy and you meticulously cut together the only 3 scenes in the entire film where a character yells, someone cries, and a glass shatters.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You put some moody, dissonant music under it, and you release a trailer that makes the movie look like a horrifying psychological thriller. Every single frame in that trailer is 100% real. The footage actually happened. But the truth of the trailer is a complete and utter lie.
That is exactly how algorithmic social media functions. The algorithm is the editor of the movie trailer. The systems driving our digital platforms do not optimize for accuracy. They optimize for attention.
And nothing grabs attention like outrage.
Decades of psychological research prove that human attention is most easily captured by negative emotion, moral outrage, and simple binary narratives.
So the algorithm actively selects the most polarizing, out-of-context clips of reality because that's what keeps our thumb scrolling.
It creates a closed-loop ecosystem. A user clicks on a sensationalized half-truth. The algorithm registers that engagement and serves them 10 more escalating variations of that narrative.
It just feeds the beast.
This creates selective exposure, where the user no longer sees dissenting information. This leads to profound identity attachment. They find a community of people seeing the same distorted reality. Eventually, they reach absolute resistance, where any contradiction is viewed as an existential threat.
So we have mapped the landscape. We know the history, the thresholds of danger, the epistemology, and the terrifying algorithmic mechanics. But now we reach the final and undoubtedly the most important section of the dossier: how to actually break the loop.
Understanding the theory is only half the battle. The practical application is what matters when you are dealing with real human beings.
Right. If you have a friend, a parent, or a coworker who is deeply locked inside one of these misinformation loops, or, if we're being brutally honest, if you suspect you might be trapped in one yourself, how do you actually update a worldview?
The dossier is uncompromising on its first rule. You cannot argue someone out of a deeply held, identity-linked belief.
You cannot logic someone out of a position they didn't logic themselves into.
Because the belief is load-bearing. It is providing emotional safety, a sense of superiority, or tribal belonging. If you aggressively attack their facts, you are attacking their structural identity. They will only dig their trenches deeper.
Right.
The dossier outlines the actual psychological process of updating a belief, which happens in 3 very slow internal stages.
Stage 1 is friction.
Friction is the seed of doubt. It cannot be forced from the outside. It usually happens internally when a prediction their worldview made fails to materialize, or when a piece of reality just undeniably contradicts their narrative, or when someone they already deeply trust expresses mild skepticism.
Stage 2 is exploration.
Once that internal friction exists, they might cautiously begin to look at alternative explanations, but this is the crucial bottleneck. They will only explore if it feels psychologically safe. If considering the alternative makes them feel stupid, gullible, or ostracized from their community, the amygdala fires, and they will instantly retreat back to the comfort of their original belief.
And stage 3 is reconciliation.
This is a gradual adjustment. Worldviews do not shatter and rebuild overnight. People update partially. They hold space for cognitive dissonance. They slowly adapt over months or years.
Knowing that this is a slow internal process, what actually works when you're sitting across the table from someone, the dossier lists specific, actionable tactics. The first is trust precedes truth.
If you do not have an established relationship built on mutual respect, Your facts will just bounce off their psychological armor.
Hmm.
Trust is the only conduit for challenging information.
The second tactic, curiosity over confrontation. Instead of shouting, here's the data proving you're wrong, ask them genuinely. Walk me through how you came to that conclusion.
Asking them to explain the mechanics of their belief often reveals the gaps in their own logic far more effectively than you pointing them out.
The third is a concept called steel manning, which is the exact opposite of a straw man argument.
Steel manning requires you to summarize the other person's viewpoint so accurately, so fairly, and with such nuance that they actually nod and say, yes, exactly, that is what I believe.
That sounds really hard to do when you disagree with them.
It is, but the moment you successfully steel man their argument, you drop their defensive shields. You prove you are listening, not just waiting to attack.
And finally, creating identity-safe updates.
Yeah.
You have to give them a psychological off-ramp. If admitting they were wrong requires them to confess they were a gullible idiot, they will fight you to the death to avoid that humiliation. You have to frame the new information safely. It makes total sense why we both believe that, given the initial reports, but this new data really changes the picture.
Change is internal. You cannot hack someone else's mind. At a societal scale, we are not dealing with one giant monolith of a misinformation problem. We are dealing with millions of overlapping, deeply personal ecosystems of belief.
So bringing it all back to real life. So sending your uncle a link to a 40-page scientific study to prove him wrong in the family group chat is literally the worst thing you can do. You have to start with empathy and curiosity.
That is exactly right. You have to start with a phone call, not a hyperlink.
We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We started with Augustus Caesar minting propaganda on ancient coins to manipulate Rome, and we traced that exact same human instinct all the way to modern algorithmic malinformation designed to hijack our dopamine receptors.
That's a long journey.
We've learned that humans don't naturally seek objective truth. We seek narratives that fit our environment, protect our social circles, and validate our deeply held identities.
And the ultimate takeaway isn't that we should walk around in a state of paralyzing paranoia, doubting everything we see. The goal is to allocate your skepticism where the stakes are the absolute highest.
Yeah.
Your health decision to your financial choices and the foundational systems of trust that hold a democracy together.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the dossier leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought. A projection into the near future that builds on everything we've discussed about the power of the identity lock.
Historically, from Augustus to newspaper moguls, propagandists had to broadcast a single, generalized message to millions of people and just hope it resonated with enough of them to be effective.
Right.
But that era is ending. As artificial intelligence becomes perfectly adept at generating tailored content at infinite scale, what happens when malinformation isn't just a broad cultural meme?
What happens when it's a narrative custom-generated in real time, designed by an AI that has scraped your entire digital history, constructed specifically to trigger your exact personal fears, your specific moral values, and your unique social anxieties?
It raises a terrifying question. Will we ever be able to rely on a shared objective reality again? Or will the truth soon become a completely personalized, isolated, custom-built psychological experience for every single human being on Earth?
It's like that internal compass we use to navigate the world. What happens when everyone's compass is magnetically locked to a completely different North Pole, uniquely generated just for them, but everyone is absolutely, violently convinced their compass is the only one that works? It's something heavy to mull over as you navigate your feeds this week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the easy answers, keep learning how the systems around you operate, and most importantly, stay curious.